Don't worry, David, I'm not going to be too cruel, I hope. Maybe a little. Well, thank you, David, for inviting me here to talk today. I have to say this talk was not actually put together for this forum, but for the Discovery Thinking Forum at the AAPG in Houston last week. But I think it does play to a couple of David's earlier points about are we beginning to run out of prolific new plays or basins, and is exploration just too expensive, and even latterly on the reopening of basins that may have been either closed for political reasons or indeed just forgotten about. So for the AAPG Discovery Thinking Forum, I was asked to put together something along the lines of describing how both technical and professional skills could combine to turn prospects into discoveries. And the story of sea lion in the North Falkland Basin, I think, tells just one of those stories, or perhaps even fairy tales. So I'd like to talk about all the factors that actually go into a success story from the perspective of a very small company, where not only just the technical story needs to add up, but also the ability to actually sell that story in public. And the title itself was 12 Months in the Life of a Small Oil Company, the Discovery and Appraisal of the Sea Lion Field. But in order to get to that 12 months, of which we're most proud, we've got quite a bit of history to cover first. So, who are Rockhopper? What did we discover? Where are the Falklands? When did we do it? And how did we come to be there in the first place? The Falklands are classified as a British overseas dependent territory. They're about 8,000 miles from the UK, and they're situated in the southern Atlantic. In terms of weather, they sit to the east and are protected by the southern tip of South America. And funnily enough, they sit at the same latitude south of the equator as London sits to the north. And at all places, they're a minimum of 480 kilometres from the coast of Argentina. And at the last count, they had a population of 2,563. The islands are self-governed in all respects other than defence and foreign affairs, and have government departments for education, agriculture, health and minerals. And the Department of Mineral Resources is the regulator of the offshore licences. The islands themselves cover about 12,000 square kilometres and sit within their own continental shelf. And the total area available to licence is 420,000 square kilometres, which, as you can see, is a size not dissimilar to the UK North Sea, or for the audience in Houston, not that dissimilar from the size of Texas. From a geological perspective, the islands sit on the southern tip of the South American plate, and they sit to the west of the relatively shallow water Falklands Plateau, which is in itself a small microplate. That microplate, probably prior to the breakup of Gondwana in the early Jurassic, lay aligned to the southeast tip of southern Africa. Now, there's been many discussions regarding whether the Falklands microplate was rotated during that separation, but those are for another day. Crucially, what we need to understand is that the extensional phase that controls the rifting in the North Falkland Basin and the depositional processes that have impacted our success were post the separation of the microplate. So if we go back to the very early history of the Falklands, the presence of potentially hydrocarbon-bearing basins was first established with some very early spec seismic shot in the late 70s by GSI and Western GECO, in addition to 3 DSDP wells that had shown us a good Jurassic to Cretaceous source within the region. From this early data, there was the presence of a rift basin to the north of the islands was established, a passive margin basin to the east, the East Falkland Basin, and to the south we see a thrust belt fallen basin type setting. We also see on here the Agulhas fracture fault zone, which still gives us a connection back to the South African plate. And finally, the Atlantic spreading ridge, which sits to the north of us. Now, no further exploration was carried out in or around the islands for some time following those early surveys. And that's what I term the basement exploration era of the Falklands. During the late 70s, unrest grew in Argentina against the military junta that had been in power since 1976. And in a surprise action, Argentinian troops invaded the islands 32 years ago this month in 1992. And a brief but bitter war ensued with a massive loss of life. Diplomatic relations weren't resumed until 1990, when talks were established to create a fisheries area, which you see here outlined. That extended some 200 nautical miles to the east of the Falklands and to the west to the boundary of the Argentinian Exclusive Economic Zone. In 1991, that agreement was extended to incorporate the natural resource rights within this area of the continental shelf. And in 1992, the British Geological Survey were employed as consultants to actually advise on the licensing of the area. And they remain today as advisors to FIG, the Falkland Island Government. Over the next 4 years, a series of spec data was shot by a number of companies in the shallow waters to the north of the Falkland Basins. And we're talking about up to 500 metres. That data was purchased by interested companies and led to a competitive bid round taking place in 1996. A total of 7 licences were awarded during that bid round, covering 48 blocks, and they were awarded to a series of major companies and consortia, which included Amarada, Shell, Lasmo, IPC, or Lundin as it is now, and Desire. Fiona, Murphy and Agip were also all major non-operated partners within those licences. That new spec seismic to the north of the islands had confirmed a north-south trending Atlantic-style failed rift. The graben was about 230 kilometres in total length and some 50 kilometres in width at its northern end, tapering down to 30 kilometres at its southern end, where we see a distinct shift in structural trend from the north-south to the northwest-southeast at the base of the graben. The basin had a fill of about 5,000 metres, and that looked to be filled with syn and post-drift sediments. And the sediments were anticipated to be Jurassic to Tertiary in age, with basement flanks probably contributing some Devonian-type clastics into the region. As you'll see, the size is not that dissimilar to the central graben of the North Sea. Following the award of licences, a busy time ensued, with companies shooting extensive 2D and, in the case of Shell, a small 3D across the basin area. And in 1997, that was continued with a series of airborne and marine gravity surveys to be shot throughout the graben. All of that work culminated in 4 of the operators collaborating under a Falkland offshore sharing agreement. That was quite innovative at its time, actually getting 4 operators to agree to carry out an exploration programme together. And together they took a semi-submersible rig, the Borgney Dolphin, down to drill a total of 6 wells in a campaign that was to last around 7 months in 1998. That campaign comprised a series of 6 wells, all of which targeted mid-Cretaceous sands, which sat within shallow structural closures associated with the mid-graben inversion event. 3 of the wells were drilled in the eastern deeper centre, 2 on the intragraben high, and 1 in the western deeper centre. And they all encountered deposits from Devonian in the 1491 through to Tertiary. But as predicted, they were predominantly filled with a thick Mesozoic syn and post-rift section, which comprised of organic lacustrine shales, and there was still a big question as to whether that shale section was going to be lacustrine or marine, with inputs of deltaic and turbiditic sands from the basin margins, as had been thought to occur. The marine section only actually comes in towards the end of the late Cretaceous and early Tertiary. In all but one of those wells, the 1492, which didn't actually reach its target, oil and gas shows were encountered. In fact, the Shell 1410-1 recorded live oil to surface, but there were no significant reservoirs associated with that oil. And that well proved to be less than 2 kilometres from the subsequent sea line discovery. At that point in time, much of the effort of the samples taken from the wells was concentrated on the geochemical evaluation of that lower Cretaceous section. And it didn't take long to determine that this was a world-class source rock of over 1,000 metres in thickness, displaying TOCs of 5 to 11% and in places up to 15%. The TOC was measured to drop as we went to the north and to the west of the basin, and it was highly oil prone with type 1 kerogens and hydrogen indexes of 600 to 1,000. Work concluded that the top of the oil window was at around 2,500 metres, but expulsion was actually occurring beneath that. And further work indicated that it was likely that the onset of oil generation was in the early Cretaceous, but oil expulsion probably didn't occur until the late Cretaceous. There was also indications of a deeper gas, indicating a much deeper gas-prone section. All of that work was put together to provide a source rock indication map here that you see on the left. And now, 16 wells later, we've managed to go further in that evaluation. And as you'll see, it was a pretty good approximation occurred at that time. So, having reviewed all of the well data from the drilling campaign, the conclusion was that the play type that had been tested was not valid, and that good quality reservoirs that had been penetrated had failed due to a lack of charge and suitable migration pathways from this very thick mature section of lacustrine source, and that the post-drift shale section that was immature, sitting beneath the targets that had been penetrated, was actually acting as a seal between the main source area and the reservoirs that had been targeted in that earlier campaign. So, in the late 90s, there was no success story, but there were great indications of a working hydrocarbon system. But, as so often happens, history conspired. The oil price had dropped to less than $10 a barrel, and oil companies were cutting back. Redundancies prevailed in the companies, and everything non-essential was halted. So a potential oil province was actually forgotten by the major oil and gas companies, and licenses were either relinquished or handed back to the junior non-operated partners. And perhaps with the threat of a major oil province being declared, relations with the Argentinian neighbours improved. So, history lesson over, we move into the Sinriff phase of the Falklands, and a small oil company is born. In reality, it didn't start its life as Rockhopper exploration in 2004, but as crude oil, a name which was soon changed after the realisation that a company called Crude Oil doing a deal with Desire may not be that sensitive. So, in a story of chance encounters, a chap, in this case Richard Visick, who owned 2 islands in the Falklands, is preparing the necessary licence documents to transport his sheep off one of those islands, Weddell. In passing, he discusses with the representative of the Department of Agriculture, who also incidentally has the brief for the Department of Minerals, that offshore oil exploration licences are now available through an open-door licensing policy. Being a property man, he doesn't have a lot of experience in the oil and gas industry, nor of raising money, a job he's left to his colleague Sam Moody. So between them they think, well, how hard can that be? So, we have an opportunity that's opened itself up to us. Now we need a vision. And we have the first 2 pieces of the jigsaw that is Rockhopper. The vision is of having obtained some licences, taking them through to a next stage of exploration, with the objective of farming down before any significant commitments are required to be funded by Rockhopper. And it's time to find a team that's done it before. And the first exploration director, Keith Williams, is brought on board. Of course, the company needs a chairman, and by yet another chance encounter, Sam is given the name of Pierre Jungels, an oil man through and through, former CEO of Enterprise Oil, and before that, MD of BG&P. Following 23 years, and that also followed 23 years with Petrofina, including several years on the main board. Pierre likes a story and has always been intrigued by the oil recovered from that earlier shell well, and the oil prices on the up. So, adding a third piece to the jigsaw, the one thing the company did start with was financial ability, if not actually the funds. Well, now the hard part starts, and Sam and Pierre set to with funding this mad escapade. Friends and family are coerced into putting some money into the company, first at a penny and then at the dizzy heights of 10p. And during the course of 2004, a total of £1.5 million is raised, enough for them to be able to apply for 2 licences, PLO 23 and 24, in the southernmost part of the North Falkland Basin. And outside, what we've just seen is mapped as the main perspective at Source Kitchen. But there's only a limited work programme of 2D in phase 1, and they can afford to go through with that. Together, though, the decisions were taken that, taking all of that history into account, the acreage that they really wanted was the former PLO2, held by Shell. But they realised that the work programme that would be required to apply for this would mean both 3D and a well commitment. So, before applying for those licences, Rockhopper negotiate to farm into the Desire acreage, which lies immediately to the south of that, with a deal to pay 15% of the work programme costs in return for a 7.5% equity. By this stage, Desire have completed their 3D over the area and identified fan plays within a high-graded zone sourced both from the west and eastern margin flanks. Buoyed by that farming and popular with the government, the Rockhopper now applies for their former PLO2, which will be split into 2 licences, PLO 32 and PLO 33. But now we have a commitment for 2D of $2 million, 3D of $20 million, and 15% of 3 wells, which is going to cost $14 million. And it's time to start getting out there and raising some cash. At this point, one of my sound effects should be ka-ching. It's time to take the company public. And an IPO raises £15 million on pre-new money valuation of £15 million. And it's a difficult time following the events at Regal Petroleum. But the IPO is successful, and Rockhopper is admitted to the AIM market of the London Stock Exchange with a market capitalisation of about $50 million. And by the way, that £15 million raise was before the fees of advisors and admissions, which took off about $2 million of that. So, piece 4 of the jigsaw, technical ability. It's now that technical ability is really needed in spades, because planning the 2D, although not that difficult, we need to really focus on how we can place the 3D in order to evaluate the area immediately adjacent to that boundary fault, which is where the play concept has been developed. We know we need to be looking for reservoirs that are located beneath the sealing shale section, and we need to be targeting the area that is close enough but not too far from the boundary fault, which can produce the clastic sediment into the basin. Preferably, therefore, running the full length of the PLO 32 block boundary from north to south. The reality, of course, though, is that when the seismic is shot, we have weather difficulties. Money runs short, and the 3D stops about 4.5 kilometres to the north of that block boundary. At that time, obviously, though not known, running straight through the centre of the sea lion field. Still, we acquired and reprocessed sufficient seismic, 850 kilometres, to fulfil the obligations, which, along with the 2D shot in 23 and 24 and the CSEM, needs interpreting. So, yep, you've guessed it, we need some more money. Ka-ching! First in 2007 and then in 2008 to enable us to pay for some of the consultancy work that's required in that interpretation. So, 3D's been shot, the seismic has been interpreted, and the rock physics work ongoing. And it's only then that we realise how expensive the consultants actually are. The seismic interpretation has indicated the presence of a low amplitude body on the seismic, which the amplitude extractions have demonstrated the existence of a large fan-shaped system. Crucially, this sits beneath the main shale section that has been seen to be sealing and sits within this Barremian-dated lacustrine shale and very close to the top of the oil window that we previously identified at about 2,500 metres. So a location was required, and the 1410-2 well location is located right at the input area of the fan into that system, in a thickened section and where we see some differential compaction on the seismic. we also saw some very good indications of AVO, which gave us a good indication of both lithology and hopefully the presence of hydrocarbons. And the sea lion prospect was mapped and reviewed for the CPR with a best estimate of about 570 million barrels in place and a chance of success of 23%. Now, throughout that period of technical work and seismic acquisition, Rockhopper had been attempting to farm out this acreage in order to be able to fund the drilling of the two wells, one on the Sea Lion prospect and one on the acreage to the south in the 23 and 24 blocks on the Ernest prospect. Operators large and small were visited, seismic was deposited, meetings were held, but of course nobody wished to take it any further. So we have to move on to the next piece of the jigsaw. It's time to put up or shut up and roll the dice and to actually take the risk ourselves. That, of course, required the support of the whole board in this process. So, ka-ching, more money is needed. Desire Petroleum, the next door neighbours, have actually managed to sign up a rig contract with Diamond Drilling to take the Ocean Guardian down to the Falklands for a 3-well programme. If we want to join, it's now or never. There's only about $1 million left in the bank, and we need enough money for the 2 wells, plus the contingency fund that FIG sensibly need to see in the bank to cover costs if things go awry. Our shareholders are behind us, and the market is certainly in a much better place than it is today. £50 million, or about $80 million, more than the market cap of the company, is raised during a hard couple of weeks begging. And we sign on the dotted line with Desire to take an assignment of the rig and the services and a share of the mobilisation and demobilisation costs. So it's at this point that the real year in the life of a small company begins. We don't know it yet, but we as Rockhopper will have the rig on hire for 10 operated wells, covering 397 days out of a combined programme that lasts for nearly 2 years, as well as simultaneously running 2 seismic vessels that between them are on hire for 302 days. Desire get the rig first and drill the Liz prospect. That's targeting a fan derived off the western margin of the Graben. Good gas shows are observed and some gas condensate is recovered, but the reservoir quality is poor due to a high content of ductile volcanics that have been sourced from the west. The Ocean Guardian moves on to location and spuds the 1410-2 Sea Lion well in April 2010, 4 years ago. Drilling is straightforward and the casing is set in the thick shale above the MAP low amplitude package. And tension, of course, is high as the shoe is drilled out. Gas is increasing and the profile extends through a full array of C1 to C5. Cuttings come back to surface and medium grain sands are recorded with bright gold fluorescence. The MWD package is some metres behind the bit and resistivity is raised and the sand package comes out as a beautiful, clean sand on the gamma ray. The well is drilled to TD and then the full suite of logs run. Being a lacustrine environment, actually judging the RW to use in the interpretation at the well site is quite tricky. And at that point, we determine that the CMR becomes the tool of choice in actually determining movable oil. In total, we penetrated over 50 metres of net sand in 2 distinct units with average porosities of 20%. So, the first well ever drilled by the company is a discovery, bringing us to the final piece of the jigsaw, luck. The piece that we would admit is the most important. But of course, a discovery can only mean one thing. Ka-ching! More money is needed to actually test the well and prove that oil can be flowed to surface. The excitement of the discovery for once makes this an easy placing, and we raised £48.5 million, or about $75 million, in a further fundraise. There's not much time to plan though, as a slot needs to be booked on the rig if we want to test the well. A test kit is dispatched from Aberdeen on the supply boat, and of course that takes about 6 weeks. And whilst en route, the results come in from the PVT analysis. We know it's a lacustrine sourced oil, and as such is quite waxy. We now discover it's got about 22% wax and a pour point of 35 degrees. However, the API is good, that's at about 29, and the viscosity is really not bad at 6 centipoise. So planning a safe test is key because we don't want to end up with a test string that has a resale value only as a candle. So it's time to increase the troops and we get in place the new team members required. To keep the staff and contractor story, we put together a team that's going to be able to pull out all the stops and think outside the box. What's clear is we won't be able to do multiple flow periods with the test string that we've got, so we need to get as much information as we possibly can from a single flow period. And we do things like injecting diesel into the formation, getting us both injectivity and providing us initial lift to the well without having the luxury of an ESP. That process all went well until the cement pump that was injecting the diesel ran out of diesel. Anyway, in the event, the well flowed at 2,000 barrels a day, flowing naturally to surface for around 18 hours. The test is completed, and at which stage the guns are retrieved, and now we discover that the lower guns have not fired. We can't go back in, but we do know that 2,000 is the lower limit, and our rate could have been much higher. We also know now what we would do differently next time, given the time to engineer a test. But for now, we're happy that the test has been safe and successful. So, we've tested a well. You've guessed it, we need some more money. Board and shareholders behind us, we decide that following negotiations with the rig contractor, we're going to keep the well down there in the basin to appraise the discovery. So this time we need to do a really big fundraise. And £206 million or $330 million is raised. And it's not just appraisal by drilling, but we need to fill in that gap, the 4.5 kilometres to the block boundary. So, whilst planning the next couple of appraisal wells, we get together with our neighbours, Argos and Desire, to plan an extensive, and by extensive I mean 4,500 square kilometre seismic campaign to start as soon as possible. September is the point at which we've tested the well, and by November we've managed to get Polarcus en route to bring down 2 vessels, the first of which mobilises towards in the middle of November 2010, just a few weeks after the test. So, now we move on to the well appraisal programme, and here's how it goes. Having been buoyed by the success of the 1410-2, which, if you recall, was drilled on the southernmost of the 2 feeders that had been identified on the seismic, we look to the north. It's about 9 kilometres up to the north to the 1410-3 well location, and the rock physics that showed us a good AVO in the south look even better to the north. By now, we've got a mini DST kit on board and the coring kit, and confident we hit the sand on prognosis. However, despite some fluorescence, we don't see any significant hydrocarbon shows. We do, however, still manage to recover oil to surface, but only from a thin interval of hydrocarbon-bearing sands, so perhaps it's not that easy after all. So, we regroup slightly and come down to the 1410-4 location, highlighted in white here, which is in the base of the synclinal structure. Sea line is within a syncline, and its lowest part runs through the centre of the field. And the intention of this well was, one, to ensure that we had the seismic thickness mapping correct, and also to see if we could penetrate an oil-water contact, or whether this was actually full beneath spill. We did indeed penetrate an oil-water contact and even managed to core right through it. So the next well in the campaign, now that we had a more extensive test kit on board, was the 1410-5. This was located back in the feeder area of the well. And on the seismic, we had 2 potential interpretations. One was that we had a really nice thick sand package, and one was that we'd lost quite a bit of that sand package through a bifurcation, from the identification of bifurcation on the actual seismic pick. Anyway, luck continues, and we end up with a 92-metre section of sea lion main complex, which helped us out enormously with our testing. What we'd discovered from the test of the 1410-2 well was the most important part was to keep that fluid at above its pour point temperature. So we had vacuum insulated tubing and an ESP. Using those pieces of test equipment, we managed to have 3 independent flow test periods and to achieve a maximum flow rate of 9,600 barrels of oil per day. That's after we applied shrinkage. We actually had over 11,000 passing through the separator. And we had a stabilised flow period for over 24 hours of 5,500 barrels of oil per day, with 3 independent build-ups and pressure tests. So now, another nail-biter. We've determined that we have over 22 square kilometres on this eastern flank of the syncline. Does that continue out to our western margin? We've been through an oil-water contact here. Do we actually have oil out to the west? Well, after a bit of a session with the regulator, we're given permission to move out to the west and to drill the 14-10-6 well. And as you can see here, we penetrate another lovely section, about 35 metres of hydrocarbon-bearing sands out to the west, in which we really haven't seen any detriment in the reservoir properties. So even here, where we're some 9 kilometres from the fan entry point, we're seeing a beautiful, clean section of sand. By this stage, we're processing the existing seismic to within an inch of its life and running various EEIs, inversion products. We're looking at spectral decomp, and some of these are also some rather fuzzy images from our first phase of spectral decomp. So we move out to the very margin of where we can map the event on that spectral decomp to see whether we're still seeing the thicknesses that we believe we can map on our seismic. So we take it to within about 50 metres of the edge that we see on that extended elastic impedance inversion product, and we find that once again we're mapping a beautiful fan package right up to the edge of this. So we know that potentially there could still be upside in this area, which isn't bright, but is rather dim on the seismic. By this stage, the new fast-track seismic is coming in off the boat, and what becomes clear is that the sea line fan is indeed extending quite a lot further to the south. Here's the pink and blue of the main sea line complex. And indeed, it's extending beyond the block boundary of 32 and 33 into PLO4, which is held by Desire, but with Rockhopper having a 7.5% stake. What's more is that we're seeing new fan bodies coming out on the spectral decomp that we're able to map in a slightly ghostly fashion. And just to give you the story of Casper, we were sitting in a bar. There was about 6 of us sitting in a bar at the AAPG in Singapore this time, when we said, "Oh, it looks a bit like a ghost, doesn't it?" So Casper the friendly ghost is indeed the origin of the Casper fan. So now it's time to drill the first well on the new seismic, and 14-10-8 is picked for 2 reasons. One, it's in a dim area of amplitude, and by now we've determined that the AVO anomalies are not related to hydrocarbons, but they're due to thickness. And so we wanted to test whether or not we still had the same level of confidence in our mapping of that seismic package outside the brights. And it's also going to test the first instance of this new Casper fan that sits on the top of sea line. Of course, we have to have another failure in the campaign. Not a geologic failure. We have a beautiful thick sand section, very clean. We see the Casper fan, as prognosed, sitting on top of sea line. And it's later on in the mapping that we determined that actually what we've penetrated is another separate fan to the main sea line complex. And the reason for this well not succeeding is that we have a beautifully open channel that goes up onto the basement high, which doesn't have any fault closure coming into it. So without the fault closure that we see here, then these fans are less likely to actually work. So this has actually penetrated a different sea line fan, SLO5 plus Casper. So beautiful sands, but realistically, without that closure, they're not going to be successful. So we have to announce a dry hole, but at the same time we have a resource upgrade, because now we've incorporated the data from the west and the east, And simultaneously, we've managed to negotiate with Desire, who hold the acreage, or the majority of the acreage in PLO4, to actually complete a farm-in. So we've negotiated with them to take 60% of PLO4B, which is a subset of PLO4, 25% of PLO4C, where we see the Jane fan, and keep our interest as it remains in PLO4A. So, you guessed it, ka-ching! In order to farm that farm-in and to carry Desire through the next well, we need some more money. And this is our last equity raise, and we raised £46.5 million at this point. And by this stage, we've actually raised over since 2004, but most principally in the course of the last year, £371 million, or nearly $600 million. So, PLO4, as I say, is split now into 3, 4B, 4C and 4A. And we, at this point, have elected to take the rig for a further 2 slots. We've just drilled a dry hole, 1410-8, and we're moving on to 1410-9 here, which is still about 5 kilometres south of the 1410-6 well, the only other well on this western half of the syncline. And we've agreed that we're going to be drilling a well in PLO4 on behalf of Rockhopper and Desire. So, as you can imagine, this is real nail-biting time. We're either going to look like heroes or numpties. But the luck continues, and the wells come in as prognosed. 1410-9, however, gives us a bit of a surprise. We now see a thermogenic gas cap sitting within the Casper formation, and a new fan that's penetrated directly beneath the Casper South, with a beautiful clean section here. And finally down to the sea line, which is existing with 2 major packages of the 2 fans sitting one above the other. We move on to the last well of our campaign, the 1415-4, and the well that's to be drilled into what we map as being the very tail end of sea line. So here we actually see that the last of the fan bodies that we've identified on the new seismic, Beverley, and this comes in with absolutely fantastic sand quality, permeabilities of over a Darcy. Again, gas bearing. We move down into the Casper South, where we see the same continuous gas-oil contact that's been picked up in the Casper in 1410-9, into Casper, which is quite thin, and then finally into what we've mapped as being the tail end of sea line. And as you'll see, we map quite a ratty section, but hydrocarbon bearing. It's also during these last 2 wells that we realise how lucky we are to be quite small and nimble, with the ability to make decisions entirely within our power. During the 1410-9 well, we were getting quite anxious. The gas shows were rising quite rapidly. We're a small company, and so we're subject to lots of bulletin board gossip. We get pressure from the FSA, who want to see if there's any movement in our share prices. So, you know, we're constantly having to record every email that we've sent that might have any insider information. So on a Sunday morning, we sit down and say, oh, we'd just like to get to TD. So we make a decision that, irrespective of whether it's going to cost us another $1 million, we're going to drill straight to TD, log the well, understand what we've got, and actually go back in and do a short offset of about 15 metres away from the original well bore, in order that we can core all the parts of the sequence that we want to core. And crucially, to core the sections that we haven't been able to get before, the very tops of those sand bodies where a lot of the information lies. So going from the shale section into the sand. And we cut a series of 4 cores in the 1410-9, and likewise throughout the 1415-4. So, you know, that was a great time for us to be able to get over that anxiety and move on. So, by the end of the campaign, in 2010-2011, we've had 16 new wells drilled in the basin. 10 of those were by Rockhopper, and 6 were by Desire, in which Rockhopper are a partner in 5. We've had 1 commercial discovery of sea lion and 3 additional discoveries in Casper, Beverley and Casper South. So it's now 2012. The rig's demobilising, It's been in the Falklands for nearly 2 years, and we've kept essentially the same crew on both the rig and in all the well services on that rig. And by the end of that campaign, through keeping that crew together, we've been drilling the wells from spud to TD in 12 days, showing both the benefits of a stable crew and also the benign drilling environment that we have in that North Falkland basin. We've been on call for 24 hours a day for 397 days. And I have to say, it is amazing how 75% of decisions seem to take place at night. And we can think about our data collection philosophy. We've managed to cut a total of 550 metres of core through each of the reservoirs that we've penetrated. And we've seen the predominance in over half of the sea line main complex of this excellent quality structureless mass flow sands that cover the vast majority of our reservoir. We've processed that data through all the core data through RCAL. We've initiated SCAL and had a few results. We've seen the consistency of the porosity across the fans. I think we only see a variation of about 1 porosity unit across the sea line main complex, and being able to use the core data to populate our facies modelling. We've run a comprehensive series of logs through every well, even in our dry hole, and processed them thoroughly to give us every piece of information that our wells can yield. Our samples have been analysed for biostrat, for geochem, and for chemostrat, which even now is continuing to yield more information for us. We've taken over 500 pressure tests across the sea line main complex and associated reservoirs, and we've had water, gas and oil samples throughout. And in fact, utilising the mini DST system that we employed following the 2 full production tests, we've been able to get very high quality samples throughout. Because after we've flowed into the wellbore for 6 or 7 hours, we know that we're getting representative samples into the wellbore. So our sea line field covers 115 square kilometres. It's 20 kilometres long at its longest point, and I don't include this northern fan here, and it's about 10 kilometres wide at its widest point. It has 2 principal fan bodies, the SL20 and the SL10, both with an average of 25 to 30 metres of thickness, and they're located at a relatively shallow depth of about 2,500 metres subsea. And they contain, between them and the associated reservoirs, about 1.3 billion barrels of oil in place. So, coming on to David's point of, can we afford this? How much did it cost? Well, we estimate that the cost of the whole work programme for us in this exploration and appraisal phase were around $450 million. We've discovered around 400 million barrels of recoverable oil. So we're looking at finding costs of just over $1 a barrel, which I think you'll find it compares quite favourably to other areas of the world. So, having twiddled our thumbs for about half a day, we had to get on with the job in hand. We needed a competent persons report. And we acknowledge that irrespective of how good Sam was at raising money, he probably couldn't find us $2 billion. So we needed to farm out and find a partner that had technical capability, financial capability, and was prepared to work in the Falklands. That farm out partner was Premier, who in July 2012 agreed to farm in, following a final little flurry and battle, and take 60% of our licences in return for back costs of $231 million, a $48 million net exploration carry, which equates to about 3 wells, being 120 million gross, a $722 million net development carry, and standby financing, which enables us to say that we're fully carried to first oil. And in November 2012, they actually took formal operatorship. So where are we today? Well, we've recently gone through Concept Select and have agreed a TLP solution. It's going to be a phased development with PLO 32 being developed, or sea line main complex within PLO 32 being developed first, and with that first phase recovering about 293 million barrels over 25 years. The second phase will encompass the southernmost portion of sea line as it exists in PLO 4, along with the additional satellites. And that'll add about another 100 million barrels of recoverable resource. And we're planning for an estimated maximum production rate of about 20,000 barrels a day. But what's really next is the ongoing exploration programme. So currently, as we speak, we're in final negotiations with rigs to continue to explore the fan trend as we move to the south. In addition, for the first time, we'll be looking to target this northerly fed fan system, which comes down from the fan very much to the north of the basin. And that, we think, was potentially penetrated right at its edge by the Shell well, 1410-1 well. And then we'll also be looking at the southern end of that main source area to look at the Elaine Isabel complex, which has been derived again from this eastern boundary fault, but meanders across to infill at a somewhat deeper and older level than the Sea Lion main complex. This is very exciting because this could contain sufficient resources to have a second sea lion, if you like, and support a standalone development. These additional fan plays here in PLO4 will be high value tiebacks to the sea lion development. So we've spent a lot of the time actually looking at the seismic data. We've done, again, we've worked on the inversion products, and we've actually managed to tie back lithology from all of the wells in the basin, from both the Rockhopper ones and the Desire ones, to actually pinpoint what we believe to be the main lithologies in this area, and select the well locations. So, if we put the jigsaw together, we've had the opportunity, the vision, the financial and technical ability, and the individuals capable of making decisions and to take the risks. We've had the support of a great board, and most importantly, that final piece of the jigsaw, luck. And that jigsaw is Rockhopper. So I've taken you through the exploration era, our basement, our SIN and post-rift, and as we move through, we hope to be at first oil in 2019. So what did we achieve? Well, we took an opportunity to acquire acreage in a basin that had proven that it had the potential to generate oil, but had not proven any reservoirs. We raised the funds to complete a work programme, which enabled a new play concept to be developed and de-risked. When we couldn't buy anybody else into that idea, we took the risk ourselves and drilled the first well that would be the first oil discovery in what is a nascent basin. We seized that moment of excitement to raise sufficient funds to both test the discovery and then to keep the rig down there and to appraise the field and 3 further satellite fields, all at 100% equity. We synchronously ran a 3D seismic campaign to delineate that reservoir, and we found 400 million barrels of recoverable resource, not to forget 1.5 TCF of gas. We managed the political risk and the effects of that on commercial contracts, and we recognised the importance of our discovery and farmed out to an operator that could take us through development whilst retaining a 40% equity in the field. And we kept to an operating philosophy that was dear to us. So, does size matter? Well, yes. If you're small and you're nimble and you're committed, you can reap rewards. Decisions are key, and we're proud that we were able to do something special in a professional and, most importantly, safe manner. But we do understand how lucky we were. And yes, it matters in recognising when 100% of something that you can't afford nor have the skill set to develop is worth absolutely nothing. At this point, I'm not going to add the sound effects of singing Don't Stop Believing, so you'll have to imagine. And finally, for those of us who have in the past offered to drink all of the oil in the Falklands, here's the first cupful. So, cheers.
Now, I'm going to keep you from your lunch a little bit. We ought to see if we've got a couple of questions, at least.
It's fine if you want your lunch.
I'm Robert Kennedy from Caithness Petroleum. First of all, congratulations. How much capital gains tax do you have to pay when you farmed out?
It's a very complicated equation because it depends on when the capital gains is payable on the exploration part of the carry, and we've elected to pay that up front. So it's about 120 million.
What is government tax take going to be?
It's 26% corporate tax and 9% royalty.
And will all the money go to the Falklands government, or will some go to the British government?
It will all go to the Falkland Island government. Now, whether there's any recompense between the two for past costs, I can't comment on.
So that means the average Falkland citizen is going to get millions of dollars a year. Not a year, but in total.
Well, it's going to... they haven't entirely determined how that money is going to be looked after. Currently, they have an oil fund that has been established, and some of the first payments of our capital gains tax have been put into that oil fund.
So really, you haven't had a fair deal, have you?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Well done on the exploration side.
Thank you.
Right, anybody else?